Hey, what's going on? This is Rob Ali, and I'm here with the Thailand Powerlifting Federation for lesson number 5, Programming for Powerlifting. And in this lesson, we're going to be talking about different concepts of training, what sort of variables do we look at when designing a program for powerlifting, the goals of training, and then we'll also be building out a full competition block just to give an example as to what you'd be looking for if you're writing up the numbers for your own programming or for one of your athletes' programming or programs. So, first thing I want to do is define what is periodized programming. So, programming is the strategy that we use in order to develop a plan for an athlete to have measurable, predictable, and consistent results. It also helps us to keep the athlete injury free and helps us keep a record of the athlete for future reference. Periodized programming is when we take a certain block of time and a certain block of time of work and then use that as the foundation to build subsequent blocks. So, for example, if we have 10 weeks of programming and that programming is bodybuilding based, right? Meaning that we're taking the athlete, putting on muscle, maybe we're moving up a weight class, maybe we're just filling out a weight class, but we're putting on muscle, and then after this 10 weeks is over, we switch to a strength style approach of training and then use that newfound muscle to build strength and then improve results on the platform. So the first 10 weeks was a foundation, and that first 10 weeks was the reason why the second 10 weeks could be successful. Because if we didn't have that newfound muscle that we developed, we wouldn't have the same results as we would in the subsequent 10 weeks. That's what periodized programming is all about. It's taking the past and then using it to build the future. And then this is how we do it with these concepts. So the first thing I want to do is talk about what are the goals of programming, and they're all interlinked. So defining one helps to define the others, and when you talk about all four, you have the full picture. And the second thing I want to talk about is the basic terminology. Concepts we'll be using when we decide to put numbers to our program and build out our made-up athletes program. So let's get started here. So the goals of programming, the first thing we'll talk about is athletic history. Now, what we want to do as a coach, or if we're self-coached, is to have a detailed record of everything the athlete's done. From day one with coaching all the way to the current date. And the reason for that is we can develop a baseline of history, meaning we can see how much work it takes for a certain athlete to grow and how much work they do on a consistent basis in order to make X amount of results, right? So I'll give you an example. And the reason why I'm giving you an example is because every athlete is variable. A certain amount of volume is not going to show the same amount of success for athlete A versus athlete B. So, like for myself, I require a lot of bench volume in order to get my bench to grow and progress. But I have athletes that I train that require half the volume that I use in order to grow at the same rate or faster. So, it's just predisposed by genetics and what the athlete's past history was before training with you. So, in order to quantify how much work is necessary in order to have this athlete grow, you have to quantify it, right? And then use that number that you have on your paper in order to build future programs for the athlete and to keep them moving in a positive direction. So that's what the athletic history is about. Actually, before I move on, one other thing we want to note in athletic history is in the event of an injury, for example. If the injury is training based, meaning let's say that the athlete's doing, let's just say they have a quad tear, for example, right? And their squat volume was at a certain level leading up to this injury. In future programs, if you approach that same level of volume again, you'll know that you're approaching the danger zone for this athlete, and you'll be able to sort of mitigate the process of injury prevention a bit better than you were in the past because you have that history to work off of. So let's say I have an athlete that has X amount of volume it takes before the previous injury for the quads. If we approach that level again, I would message my athlete and say, listen, we're approaching a point where we need to be focusing on recovery a lot more, make sure you're hydrated, you're sleeping a lot, and that you're taking a lot of precautionary measures in order to prevent injury. And this is useful information because it's based off of the history that we developed from the athlete. So that's another reason why we program and mark everything down as we go along. So the next two go hand in hand, consistency and predictability. When we're developing a program, we want to be able to have measurable results, and especially in a sport like powerlifting where everything is number-based. So by marking down the history of an athlete and keeping track of everything, you'll be able to predict with time where your athlete should be with a certain amount of volume increase, intensity increase, etc. And so it's important to keep track of everything because of this. Some athletes can grow tremendously, like I said, depending on their genetics and their adaptability to certain types of programming. And then some athletes may not, so we want to keep record of that. We also want to be able to predict the athlete's response to certain types of training. So, for instance, I've had athletes before who have had hip problems, and so specifically that have hip problems out of the bottom of a squat. And so keeping a record of which movements was helpful for the athlete and then detrimental for the athlete was important for me, so I can go back and see what worked for this person. Now, certain styles of training are lend more to certain types of athletes than other athletes. And so for this athlete, for example, I would have them do pin squats, where at the bottom of the squat, the bar will be rested on pins, and then pressure will be taken off his hips temporarily during the transitionary phase from eccentric to concentric, and that helped him out. He was able to keep moving forward without having that nasty pain in his hips. And then also you're able to see how much I expect as a progression with a certain amount of volume increase from competition to competition. So for this athlete, the same one, I would expect, say, a 7.5 kilo increase on his squat between each competition if we're evenly spaced throughout the year, whereas some other people might be only 2.5 kilos, some people might be 10 kilos, depends on the person. And so when you're developing strategy for the competition day itself, you can base some of your strategy off of the progression that we've seen through the history of the athlete. So we'd also want to plan for the long term, in the sense that we don't want to plan for the next 4 weeks at a time only and then see where we're at and then keep going. We'd like to at least write out the theory of what we'd like to see for the next several months of training in order to better put the athlete on a plan for development. By just shooting from the hip or improvising training, even though we may be marking it down, would not be the best approach, because we want the athlete to progress along the lines that we want them to, as opposed to just kind of going off of feeling. This takes out some of the emotional side of training and helps the athlete to stick to a plan and to be more logical in training as opposed to just lifting emotionally. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the basic terminology that will relate to the goals that we just discussed. And there are 5 basic terms I'd like to discuss before we start to build out that made-up program for the athlete. The first is volume, then intensity, fatigue management, progressive overload, then stimulus, recovery, and adaptation. And these are all intertwined together. So as we talk about these, each of these concepts, they should start to make more and more sense because they all link up together to better meet these goals. So the first concept we're talking about here is volume. This is the total amount of work you've done as an athlete. And there's 2 types. There's absolute and relative volume. So absolute volume is the total amount of weight on the barbell multiplied by the amount of sets multiplied by the amount of reps. So if we're looking at say one session of training, and you squat 100 kilos for, let's say, 5 sets of 5, right? That's 25 reps multiplied by 100 kilos. So you're looking at 2,500 kilos of work performed during that session. And that's your total volume, right? So I can say when I'm writing out the program that this person has done 2,500 kilos worth of volume. That's the amount of work that this person has done for that session. Now, if we take that and apply that for the long term, and then say over the course of the past 6 weeks, we've done X amount of absolute volume on squat, That's our quantifiable number for work for that athlete. So that's the absolute volume, a numerical figure to describe the amount of work done. Relative volume does not take into account the amount of weight actually moved by the athlete. Now, this would be used more so for bodybuilding type movements, or if you're using an RPE system, which is just a scale from 1 to 10, where the athlete would describe how hard a set felt to them, where a 10 out of 10 would be the absolute hardest the athlete could push, and then 1 out of 10 would be the absolute easiest, like they're not putting any effort at all. That's where relative volume comes into play. Like, if I were to assign an athlete, let's say, not that I would normally do this, but say just bicep curls, for example, I would never tell them to do 30 pounds or however many kilos worth of weight to do. I would say to them, work up to a difficulty of 8 out of 10, which means they would leave 2 reps in the tank. And I would tell them to work up to a weight that meets that standard. For relative volume, what I would do for that athlete is track the total amount of reps done in that, and that would be sufficient for data collection. So basically, let's say the same person does 30 reps on I'm going to use quads a lot, a quad movement, right? That's 30 reps worth of work. Now, if the athlete achieves that difficulty of roughly 8 out of 10, then that's sufficient a difficulty performed by the athlete in order to promote an adaptation in the quads. And that's why it's okay to mark that down for relative volume. The reason why you might go with absolute volume versus relative volume would depend on what kind of exercise we're talking about. So generally speaking, I only focus on the absolute amount of work performed if we're talking about the main movement. So squat, bench, or deadlift, or any slight variations of it, meaning like tempoed squats or negative deadlifts or wide grip spoto bench presses, things like that. A variation of the main competition lift that isn't so dissimilar as to be a totally different movement. It's dissimilar enough to create a different adaptation, but not too similar enough. Sorry, let me reverse that. It's similar enough where it creates an adaptation for that main movement, but it's not dissimilar to the point where it's going to be unquantifiable by absolute volume. So that's one reason why you use absolute volume. Relative volume would be used in the event of an accessory movement, like a quad extension or a glute bridge or something like that. So the next concept is intensity. So intensity is just the amount of weight on the bar relative to your 1 rep max. So let's say that you can squat 100 kilos for 1 rep. 80% of that would be 80 kilos. And so the intensity is quantified by the percentage used of your 1 rep max, 80%. This concept and this concept are the two most important things to think about when you're designing the numbers of your program, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But generally speaking, you'd like your athlete to be anywhere from, say, 65% on the low end of the spectrum, all the way up into 85% in order to build an athlete, right? And that's a very big range, but we'll talk about the program in a second, how we should apply which ranges of the percentage to which parts of your training. So that's the intensity. And obviously, as you get closer to a competition, you want to use higher and higher intensities. So as we get to the peaking phase, for example, we'd like to use the high 80%, low 90%, mid 90% as we get closer and closer to a competition, in order to allow the athlete to adapt to that style of training, because on the platform we're going to be approaching 100% for 1 rep. And we want the athlete to get used to that feeling. So that's volume and intensity. The next 3 concepts are the basic pillars of strength development. Alright, so the first concept we want to talk about for the 3 principles of strength training is fatigue management. Now for fatigue management, we're going to link this to volume and intensity. If we work hard and sufficiently within that difficulty range we define, about 8 out of 10 difficulty per session, let's say, that fatigue will accumulate over the course of time, over weeks and months, and eventually add up to how we feel on a daily basis going into training. And so that's called chronic fatigue, the fatigue built up over time from training. Likewise, intensity is the total amount of, so not the total amount, but the percentage of intensity of your 1 rep max you're training at, and then that mixed with the volume that you've done in a session will create acute fatigue. So acute fatigue is the tiredness you feel, the DOMS, which is the delayed onset muscle soreness, or the central nervous system fatigue you feel from an intense session, right? And that's from a very short amount of time, 1 session or 2 sessions, all right? If you ever felt after a competition that you're extremely tired and mentally unfocused the next day or the next couple of days, that's acute fatigue that you felt from pushing your body to its absolute maxes. So we need to be able to manage this type of fatigue over the course of training. Now, acute fatigue built up over time is unsustainable. Meaning if we're going to the gym and then maxing out every single time we go into the gym, we'll build up a lot of central nervous system fatigue, and then if we accumulate that over the course of time, we'll start to underperform in training, and then won't be able to create those predictable, measurable, consistent results we want over time, like we said in the beginning part of this video. So we need to be able to vary these two enough where we're recovering from training, but we're also pushing our bodies enough where we're adapting well and able to make progress. So that's fatigue management in terms of volume and intensity. Now there's a couple other things I want to talk about here. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but when we're building out a block of training, at the end of a certain amount of time, we want to take what's called a deload, which is basically just a week or 2 of training in which volume and intensity is reduced a lot in order to make sure the athlete is able to recover, gives the athlete a break from training, and helps to create mental stability within an athlete. If you push yourself too much over time, you can show signs of overtraining, which would be irritability, anger, like being short-tempered, being chronically fatigued, being overly tired, just negative characteristics of too much training. So the deload period will help to keep the athlete happy. It will keep them injury-free or injury prevented. It'll also help them to make more progress over the long term. So that's why we take deloads. Now, the reason why I want to talk about deload is because I wanted to talk about recovery techniques during regular training and then also during the deload period. And I'll explain what I mean here. So when you're in your normal state of training, where you're pushing hard, let's say 80%, 5x5s, whatever it may be, throughout your normal training block, it's okay to use recovery techniques to manage your fatigue, such as soft tissue mobilization, meaning like concepts like ART, acupuncture, massage, stretching, things like that. That's all good to use during training. What's not good to do during those building blocks of training is to do temperature type of therapy for recovery. So meaning a sauna, ice baths, cold or hot shower, contrasts, things like that are not best used during the regular training block, because during training we're creating an inflammation response in our muscles. That's why our muscles feel sore after we're done with training. And we want that inflammation. That inflammation helps cause the adaptations we want for progress and for strength on the platform. And so it's best not to use temperature, because temperature alters that inflammation within our muscles. So don't do those temperature therapies when you're in the midst of training, but rather save them for your deload period when you're focused completely on recovery, when we want to take away that inflammation. And so during the deload period, it's okay to do that. If you need to do temperature therapy once in a while during the block, I would say it's only okay if you're feeling like a muscle tweak or some extra amount of pain that's normally not there. But generally speaking, I would say stay away from temperature therapy when you're in the midst of your training, during the building blocks, and then only save that for the deload periods, which comes maybe every 8 weeks or so in training. Okay, so that's fatigue management there. So the next concept I want to talk about is the concept of progressive overload. Now, progressive overload states that training must be difficult, but it also must get more difficult over time. And this is because as we develop as athletes, we get stronger, and the requirements for our body to develop become much higher in demand. And so we must do more work in order to grow. Right? Elite athletes always do a lot more work than intermediate or beginner athletes because of this concept. So, a couple things with progressive overload. I wanted to talk about this. This will actually link up with the intensity specifically, and why there was such a big range, 65% to 85%. I used before for when you're developing a block of training for an athlete. So, progressive overload. When we're looking at training, we can divide training into 3 basic phases, and then the phases can be subdivided even further, but for the sake of this video, we'll use 3. The first is hypertrophy, in which we are building muscle in an athlete. The second is strength building, in which we take the muscle that was developed in hypertrophy blocks and then creating a program which allows for more force production within the muscle. And then peaking. And then peaking is taking the previous 2 blocks, hypertrophy and strength training, and then adapting the athlete for competition performance, meaning doing 100% of their ability, and then allowing the athlete to recover from training and then to show their best performance on the platform. So as you go through a block of training and you go through hypertrophy, strength, and then peaking, when you go to the next block, you'll have to do more work than the previous competition block in order to grow, because if you've done your job correctly, the athlete will be stronger. So let me define some of these concepts here as we're talking. So the first concept was the history. No, I'm looking at this as I'm erasing it. The first concept we want to talk about for the percentages was hypertrophy. So let me go over here. Next was strength. I'll just mark these down as we go. And then the last was peaking. Okay, so for hypertrophy, let me scoot back over here. For hypertrophy, you want to increase work done and use the concept of progressive overload by volume. So like we talked about earlier, volume is the total amount of work done by an athlete. But if we're going off percentages, we like ourselves to be somewhere within, say, 65% of your 1 rep max in any one of the main lifts to, let's say, about 75% of the main lifts. And in this phase of training, we're not really pushing the intensities of training, and that's because we're trying to build muscle, and this is a good range to work with. Now, in this style of training, you also want to have higher rep ranges, which is not the most fun for powerlifters, but it's important to do. Bodybuilding and powerlifting are very intertwined, and so this is where that crossover comes. So you might look at, let's say, anywhere between 6 reps and 12 reps per set. Now, depending on the type of athlete and the amount of volume you have them doing, the amount of total work may vary. But let's say the classic, say 4x8 or 3x10 would be fine for this this phase of training. And as you go through your hypertrophy block, the training should get harder. At the end of this, take a little deload period, and then move on to the next phase, which is the strength phase. Alright, so the next phase is the strength phase over here, which builds upon the hypertrophy phase. And for here, we're going to be looking for the main lifts to be somewhere within the 75% range to 85%. Right in that range. And generally speaking, this is the best percentage range that you'd like to be in when developing a strength block in order to develop more force output within an athlete's muscles. So be in this rep range, and then for the sets and reps, you'd like to be within, say, at the lowest end of the rep range, about 3 reps, highest end of the rep range, about 6. And then again, the volume that you use will depend on the athlete and then the past history of work required to grow. So this compounds on this, and then likewise the peaking will compound on the strength block. And so, before I continue, actually, the strength block will be, let's say, it could be anywhere between 6 weeks to 10 weeks. All right, and that will compound on the hypertrophy block, which is about 2 months-ish, 3 months, depending on where you're at in training. So the peaking compounds on the strength block, and for peaking, we're going to increase the intensity again. So we're going to go anywhere from 85% all the way to about 95%. In some cases, you can go to 97, depends on the athlete and how they adapt to specific intensities of training. But generally speaking, I would like to stick within this range. And this will usually be about 2 to 3 weeks. The peaking process is not necessarily the entire competition block, but rather the 2 weeks it takes to create neural adaptations where you're preparing the nervous system to handle this intensity of weight, and then also the peaking process, the peaking block here rather, is help to develop technique and practice for competition, because we are pushing into the 90 to 100% range on competition day. So after you're done with the peaking process, you're going to do a deload week, and then generally speaking, at the end of this week would be your competition, so you can focus on recovery physiologically, mentally, and nutritionally as well. So that would be the entire process it takes in order to get to a peak. And like I said in the beginning of the video, this is the base of our pyramid, where we have the large foundation. Then as we go higher up in the pyramid, the main meat of the pyramid would be the strength phase, and then the top would be peaking with deload, and then that's when we actualize and realize all of the total amount of work we've done over the course of the training cycle. So now I'm going to take a second to pause the video here. I'm going to erase this board, and I'm going to write out a very quick but made up program for an athlete, and we can go over all these concepts together. Okay, so here is the breakdown for how we're going to look at everything for a competition cycle from week 1 all the way to week 23 in this example. It doesn't have to be 23 weeks, but I just use just about a 5.5 month prep as an example for this specific board here. So for weeks 1 to 10, we're working on hypertrophy. We're building muscle, correcting imbalances in the athlete, and that's in a 65 to 75% intensity range, about 6 reps to 12 reps per set. Weeks 11 to 19 is an 8-week strength block. That's going to be from 75% to 85% of intensity, and we're focusing on force production in the athlete. So the athlete should try to move the bar as quickly as possible while keeping technique in mind as well. And this is where we're going to be focusing on our technique for strength. So make sure that technique is developed here, because it's going to carry over in competition later on down the pike. So after with strength, we're going to move on to the weeks 20 to 22, which is the peaking part of our competition prep, 85 to 95% rep range, and we're creating our neural adaptations here, which is going to be our training of our nervous system for competition. And then here, it's good to note that in week 1, so this is going to be weeks, say 20 to 21, we're focusing on higher volume and intensity, increasing in that, and then creating those adaptations, neural adaptations through volume and intensity. And when we get into week 22, right before we get into the deload period here, we're going to have the intensity remain high or increase in intensity, and then reduce volume slightly. So let's say 2/3 of the volume from the previous week. So week 21 would have the highest amount of volume. Week 22 would have about 2/3 of the volume of week 21. And then we move into the peaking week, the deload week, which is week 23, and from here we'll take about 70 to 80% intensity on the bar for about half the intensity of week 22. All right. The reason why we do this is because we don't want the athlete to be under any more stress than necessary just to practice the lifts and to prepare for competition. So at this week right here, they're going to be focusing mainly on their nutrition, which they should be the entire time, but nutrition for recovery, their physiological recovery, meaning just recovery from all the fatigue they put themselves under and the stress they put themselves under through training, and the last would be psychologically. So just preparing their mind for the competition, which is actually a good place to end this video, because next week we're going to be talking about sports psychology in powerlifting and how to focus our mind for competition, how to have the right mental state of mind during training, and that's going to be what we talk about next week. So if you have any questions on this, feel free to reach out to myself or the TPF. I know this is a lot of information. We could really talk about several hours about this, but we've condensed it all into one video. In future courses, we'll be offering lessons on each individual piece of this and break it down even further if you'd like to take those courses. But until then, we'll see you guys in the next video. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself at my Instagram, Rob Ali Strength, or the Taiwan Powerlifting Federation's Instagram, or you could reach out to my email, which is robalistrength@gmail.com, or you could reach out to the Taiwan Powerlifting Federation as well. Okay, thanks everybody for joining us. We'll see you in lesson number 6.